joined by Major General Bill Chen, U.S. Army retired and former defense industry executive, who will share his leadership journey in breaking the bamboo ceiling. He is the first Chinese American to wear the rank of Major General in the U.S. Army and attained top management positions in the defense industry. As a third-generation Chinese American, he will talk to what was passed down by his grandfather, who immigrated to the United States in 1878, and his father, who was born in the United States. And he will talk to his own practice of blend in, stand out. And I now give the floor to the General.
Thank you for that nice introduction. We can make this very informal. I'd like to highlight that part of my title has the words blend in, stand out. And that's a practice that I follow. In fact, I have a book that I've written that's entitled Blend In, Stand Out. Currently, it's at a publisher being reviewed, and so I'm trying to find out whether they'll accept it or not. And anyways, on this chart, I'd like to highlight some key aspects of my experience. I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan. I also have an MBA from Auburn University. At the center there is that unit crest, Excellence in Missilery. And that is the unit crest of the U.S. Army Missile Command. And I can almost say I kind of grew up at the Army Missile Command, where I was assigned there as a first lieutenant, later as a major, a colonel, and then as the two-star commanding general of the U.S. Army Missile Command. The next emblem is the Department of Army, which is the headquarters for the U.S. Army, called the Department of Army, and I was there as a lieutenant colonel, colonel, then a brigadier general, and a two-star, working in the office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Research, Development, and Acquisition. On the right-hand side is a photo of me after I retired from the Army. I worked for United Defense, which was acquired by BAE Systems, and then my last assignment was FNSS Defense Systems, which was a joint venture U.S.-Turkish company in Ankara, Turkey, and I was the U.S. Vice President General Manager. Okay, on the left are flags for Vietnam and Laos, and I was there during the Vietnam War, in Vietnam, and then later in Laos. Next chart, please. The objective of my presentation is as shown. I want to try and highlight the principles, blend in and stand out, and it's of course focused on advancement, particularly for those that might be in the technical field, but really should aspire to top management positions. And then I'll highlight various actions and practices based upon my experience. Now, the lower left shows the rank structure of the military, starting as a lieutenant on up to general officer. But regardless of the organizations that you're in, you could be in a commercial organization, you could be working for Goldman Sachs, for example. There's a hierarchy. You know, you could start out as an analyst and then build up your skills and capability, get elevated to higher levels. But most organizations, of course, have a hierarchy. So how do you get to the top? And so that's part of my discussion today. Next chart. Okay, what is the bamboo ceiling? I've highlighted that here, but it really is a bamboo ceiling if we apply it to Asian Americans. But wherever we work, there's always a ceiling of some sort. It could be a ceiling, it could be an obstacle, it could be how you get into an Ivy League college, right? It's a It's a challenge, it's an obstacle, and many of you have already succeeded in that because you're here. Now, if you look at what I have for common perspectives of Asian Americans, that might be the case for a lot of Asian Americans, but it's not applicable to all Asian Americans. If you focus on what's in red, what I identified as the stereotype, and you read all of those bullets, I can say for myself that that described me because I was part of that stereotype. Now, why is that? Probably a little bit because of my upbringing. You know, what was I taught when I was young? You got to study hard. You have to be courteous, polite, right? Don't tout yourself. In other words, don't self-promote. And so that was how I was brought up. Next chart. Okay. Starting from my grandfather, he came to the United States in 1878. He was a Chinese railroad worker, and this was for the Second Continental Railroad that went from California across Arizona to El Paso, Texas. And the workers were released. And then he migrated through the South and then to Ohio, where my father was born. But like most first-generation immigrants, what did they pass down to their children? Hard work. And number two, need to get an education. So that's what he did. My father, for example, was the first in his family to graduate from college. However, he was orphaned at 15. He had to work his way through high school and college. He graduated from the University of Michigan with a degree in aeronautical engineering in 1932. But that was the middle of the Depression. He wasn't able to get a job in engineering because it was the Depression. Number two, at that time, aircraft companies weren't hiring Orientals, in spite of the fact that he was born in the U.S. But he had a passion for aviation. So he saved up enough money to take flying lessons, and he got a commercial pilot's license, and in 1936 he went to China and he flew for an airline, China National Aviation Corporation. And then with World War II, he joined the U.S. Army Air Corps and was a pilot in the 14th Air Force under General Claire Chennault, the legendary leader of the Flying Tigers. Okay, then post-World War II, he worked for an airline that was co-founded by General Chennault. And then afterwards, after being an airline executive, he then had established his credibility and a reputation that he then was hired by an aircraft company, Northrop Aircraft Company. So his story arc was he was initially not hireable by an aircraft company, but then after his experiences, he wound up working as an aircraft company executive. So what he passed down to his three sons was the need to integrate and assimilate in the workforce, wherever you're working, as well as in the community. Now, what I did, based upon my experiences, kind of transform that to blend in and stand out. And I did. We need to blend into the customs, traditions, culture of wherever you work to be a part of that. And then you need to stand out. And I'll talk more about that later, next chart. Okay, so here's what I've highlighted, and if you would, focus on the red. Wherever you are, whether you're in school, you're in an organization, whether you're working for the government, you need to be able to mix, establish good relationships. I use the term good buddy ratings, and that applies to wherever you are. You know, if you're in a club, if you're on an athletic team, you know, you're working together as a team, and you gain the respect of your fellow teammates. And then get known to your superiors. And then the next highlights, you have to be affable. You can't be that Chinese American or Asian American that sticks to his cubbyhole. And yes, he or she might do good technical work. But then, if you want to advance, you have to gain the confidence and trust of your superiors. And then they'll recognize you for that, and when the tough assignments come, they'll give them to you so that you'll be recognized and have an opportunity to excel. Next chart. Okay, what do we mean by standout? Asian Americans already stand out because of our color. What does that mean? That means that wherever you are, in whatever organization you're in, you're going to be observed. You're going to be known. So how do you want to be known? That's why you need to have good communication skills, good leadership skills, be able to even promote yourself a little bit, because you then stand out even more than just based upon your color. So how do you do that? How do you excel in your communications? Interpersonal relationships are very important. How do you get along with other people? And are they going to characterize you as that guy or gal that is so quiet that you don't know that they're inscrutable, right? So the other thing is you have to master people skills when you're a supervisor. You know, there's a myth in the Army that just because of your rank that you can tell people to do things and that will get done. The reality is, what is leadership? Leadership is the art of getting work done through people. So, art is not science. Yes, you can learn certain techniques that might be called, you know, science. But you're working with people. You need to learn how to motivate people, generate interest in whatever the task or work is. And I believe that you'll get more out of it. Okay, you've got to be assertive. So that means, you know, maybe based upon your upbringing, you were taught to be polite and reticent. Now, being assertive doesn't mean that you go overboard as well, because then you'll be characterized as somebody that is toxic, if you understand that. So, part of being a leader then is to motivate the people that work for you, or the people that are in your organization. Now, how do you do that? In my case, I found the need to go on a leadership journey. Now, some of you, next chart, might be born leaders, natural born leaders. So maybe you don't have to work as hard. But what I found is I needed to study hard in leadership positions. For me, it required rehearsal. And in today's environment with technology, it's visualization, simulation. You know, you're in a situation, you need to demonstrate what you can do to identify what the organization should do and motivate people to do it. You might have to go through some simulation to help you in that process. Now, you can be a leader as well and learn as a leader, as a team member, working together as a team. But most important, in addition to working together as a team, you can see what the leader does and see if you want to emulate that leader. And so I have that down as emulate good leadership. Develop people skills and interpersonal skills. I'll give you an example. In my career, I wanted to be a project manager, where in the Army, there's a project manager that manages a major defense system. And then the project manager directs the prime contractor to develop this weapon system. And I went to a project management school. And so I said, hey, that's great. I'm going to learn all about system engineering, business management, contracting, logistics. But what I found, and those are what I would call technical management skills. But what I found most beneficial to me was a course called Interpersonal Relationships in a Project Office. And that's where I learned about people skills, how to get work from people that need to support whatever your project is, but they don't work for you directly. And so that's part of my learning experience, that it's not just technical management skills required, but people skills. Okay, now, in a particular organization, in a particular position, what are the metrics for performance? Most companies would have a performance appraisal. In the Army, we have that, and for officers, it's called an officer evaluation report that evaluates you on performance and your potential. Potential meaning not the immediate position, but you're evaluated on potential to serve in higher level positions. And so knowing that I would have recurring performance appraisals and evaluation reports, that motivated me to try and excel. Next slide. Okay, so I'd like to now summarize my leadership journey. I mentioned the passion, for example, that my father had for aviation. So in whatever you do, hopefully you have passion. And in my case, I had a passion for Army missiles and rockets. When I was a sophomore, in 1957, Sputnik 1 occurred. That was the Soviet Union launch of the first artificial satellite in the world. Of course, in those days, they didn't have the internet. You couldn't Google that and get all this information. You know, I heard about it in the news, I went to the library, etc. And so the United States response to that, the first U.S. satellite was Explorer 1, launched by Dr. Werner von Braun, former German scientist, who was at Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama, and he led the team for the launch of that first satellite, using as a booster an Army missile rocket. And so when I heard that, I immediately said, I want to learn as much as possible about Army missiles at Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, And then I said to myself, when I go on active duty, I want to work in Army missiles. So I worked on various systems shown on the right. The first assignment I had to Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama, was in a project office dealing with anti-tactical ballistic missile defense. And they had a project manager for that, and I immediately said to myself, I want to be an Army project manager, like the colonel that was the Army. So what then did I have to do? I had to try and get recurring assignments in project management, and as shown there, and you have to have a goal in what you want to do. You have to look at role models. Now, when I was in the Army, there were no Chinese American or Asian American superiors, no contemporaries, no subordinates. And so in looking for effective role models, what you should do is look for effective role models, regardless of whether they're Asian Americans or non-Asian Americans. Okay, I finally reached my goal, and then I began to think, maybe there's something that I can advance to beyond that. And I did. I became a two-star general, commanding general of the U.S. Army Missile Command, and then later in ministry, a vice president, general manager. Okay, this chart summarizes what I call positive indicators and obstacles. And if you focus on the left-hand side, on one hand, it might be too military for this audience, but just keep in mind that in the military, advancement to schooling is very important. Command is very important, and I got selected for battalion command, which normally has about 1,000 soldiers. I was promoted to colonel, then brigadier general, major general, and so forth. And then on the right-hand side, I had these various obstacles that are shown. Let me just make a comment. For example, I was an advisor to the Vietnamese Army, to the Royal Thai Army, and the Royal Lao Army. In many respects, in a normal career, that would be the kiss of death. Because if you're in the U.S. military, you know, the macho thing was command of U.S. troops, not being an advisor. But realistically, as part of the U.S. military policy, advisors were important. And anyways, I was an advisor to 3 of those armies, and yet I got selected for battalion command and progressed further. Of course, the other big obstacle is the pyramid effect, where there's a hierarchy and very few positions at the top. So maybe in the question and answer period, you want to ask me the question of, why do you think I didn't get promoted for another star? Okay, next up. All right, we can have a lot of fun with this. We can spend a lot of time on this if you want. But let me just talk about the first upper left chart. I gave a presentation at the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. And I had a chart of me with that baby picture, 3 years old on the left, and then on the right-hand side, a picture of me as a major general. And I talked about 3 titles for that chart. Okay, one title is The Spirit of World War II. Who dresses up a 3-year-old? My mother, right? So here she was, the wife of a serving lieutenant in the U.S. Army Air Corps, proud of that service, and dresses up her kid in uniform. Okay, another title could be living your dreams. Okay, how do you go from the left-hand side, 3-year-old in uniform, to the right-hand side, at that time, 2-star Major General? You do it by living your dreams, but more importantly, hard work, good fortune. Sometimes you got to be at the right place at the right time. Good bosses, while blending in and standing out. Okay, so the next set of charts, upper chart, me in Vietnam, second chart in Laos. And so you could characterize those as building blocks or career enhancing assignments in preparing me for later on assignments. Okay, then at the bottom there was when I first got promoted to 1-star rank, and how did I get there? I got there through the 2 images by being the project manager of those 2 weapon systems. Okay, the first one was what I would call a medium-sized program, but we were successful because the program was developed, produced, and then deployed. The second system is a much larger program that I got handpicked to take over. But the program was in trouble. And so it was actually a brigadier general's program. I was still a colonel, but they put me in there because my bosses at that time handpicked me, believing that they needed somebody like me to take over this program that was in trouble. Okay, then the next series of charts when I was promoted to 2-star rank, and then on the far right upper, during that time period, roughly 1990, the President of the United States came to visit, so I had the privilege of greeting him, and he addressed the families and soldiers at Redstone Hospital. And then the lower chart was after I commanded the U.S. Army Missile Command, I was put in charge of all missile defense systems in the Army. One of those was the Patriot missile system, and I was the architect for crafting a strategy that selected between 2 competing contractors. We can go into that in more detail if you'd like in the Q&A session, but that resulted in the selection of the Army's first hit-to-kill technology missile interceptor. And by hit-to-kill, it's analogous to a bullet hitting another bullet. Next chart. Okay, here's a recap of my comments on leadership. Probably the most important thing above is you need to make a self-assessment. And with that, be willing to improve. You need to step out of your comfort zone. And, you know, if you want to have a nice life and a comfortable environment, you can kind of, you know, graduate and settle down in a nice position. But if you want to improve yourself and reach higher levels of management, then there's work involved. Okay, so the other comments are dealing with being a good leader, communications, and I can't overemphasize emulate good leadership. Now, a lot of people ask me along the way, you know, was I concerned or disappointed that there were no Chinese or Asian American leaders above me that I would emulate? And I said, I don't think it matters, because I'm an American officer who happened to be of Chinese origin. I want to emulate effective leaders. And so that's my recommendation and comment. Next. Okay, so this is an overall wrap-up. And hopefully you take away from this the fact that maybe you need to embark on a leadership journey based upon your self-assessment. At the same time, maybe you don't, because you're already there. But it doesn't matter. What you need to do is look at what it takes to excel and reach the goals that you establish. Okay, I want to just make a comment at the bottom there. The book that I wrote is called Blend In, Stand Out, Providing Firepower to Warfighters. And then it's a recap of my leadership journey.